طيب سيكون المتحدثين الأوليين الرئيسيين في بداية هذه الجلسة الأولى باللغة الإنجليزية، فلو أحد يحتاج جهاز الترجمة يا ريت تجهزوه لو تكرمتم. طيب إن شاء الله نحن نبدأ الجلسة الأولى من مؤتمر ضمانات العدالة للضحايا والمحاسبة لمرتكبي الجرائم، مسار العدالة الانتقالية في سوريا. الجلسة الأولى ستكون بعنوان توثيق انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان كمدخل لإحقاق العدالة وضمان المحاسبة. لدينا 6 متحدثين، كل متحدث سيعطى 10 دقائق، ثم سنترك المجال للأسئلة والإجابات، ثم تؤخذ دفعة واحدة وتوزع بعدها على بقية المتحدثين. So we'll start the session titled Documenting Violations as a Means of Achieving Justice and Ending Impunity. And we'll start with Mr. Megan Price, Director of Research at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. Would you mind, Ms. Megan?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I am humbled and honored to be included in a room with the groups doing the very difficult and dangerous work of documenting what is happening in Syria right now, not to mention the families of the victims. So thank you. I really appreciate being included. And I would like to start by saying that my talk is probably going to sound quite different from what we opened our morning with. And as a scientist, I know that very often I have a tendency to use language that may sound insensitive or distant. And I want to be clear that I know what we're talking about today are the lives of individual humans. But I also want to say that I think those humans deserve the best that a rigorous scientific analysis has to offer, because I do think that that kind of analysis can start us down the path toward accountability. So I am going to speak this morning rather technically, and it may sound a little bit distant, and I am sorry for that. But if we want to go ahead, what my team, my colleagues Dr. Patrick Ball and Dr. Jeff Klingner and I were tasked with doing was examining 7 data sets documenting killings in Syria between March 2011 and November 2012. And what we were tasked with was identifying records that referred to the same victim. So right from the beginning, we were only considering records that contained enough information to identify an individual. So a complete name, a location, and a date. Already that's excluding a number of records in these data sets, and we can talk about that during the Q&A. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Now, a reasonable thing to ask at this point is, why were we tasked with this? And the answer is that collectively on our team, we have nearly 20 years of experience of doing this kind of work in a variety of locations under a variety of sets of circumstances. Collectively, we've worked in 30 countries on 9 official truth commissions, 3 international tribunals, 3 UN missions, and 2 national trials. So this is the kind of data analysis that we do a lot. And if you go ahead to the next slide, what we have learned is that this is very, very difficult. Conceptually, what you're thinking of is, if I look at one record in one data set and I compare it to every other record in that data set and every other record in all of my other data sets, How do I know if it matches any of those records? How do I know if it refers to the same victim? So we think about doing those comparisons in pairs. Now, right away, we started with over 147,000 identifiable records. So that leaves us with hundreds of millions of possible comparisons that we could make. And so that points us in the direction of automation. That brings us to using machine learning and computer algorithms to tackle this problem. One of the first things that we do is set up what we call rejection rules. And essentially this is a way of telling the computer these records will never match because they have a different sex. They are describing locations that are geographically very far apart, or they are describing events that occurred on days very far away from each other. So we reduce the number of comparisons we need to make by excluding ones that we know are not going to match. This still brings us to between 3 and 11.5 million possible comparisons that we need to look at. There's a range there because the 7 data sets cover different time periods, and so we actually did this comparison in 3 sections depending upon the time period and the data sets that covered that time period. But it's a lot of comparisons. And so the next thing that we do is create numeric comparisons. In this case, we did a total of 18. I don't have time to talk about them specifically. I'm happy to during a question and answer on one of the breaks. But we compared names, dates, locations, and numerically summarized that. Go to the next slide. And then we generate a training set. And an individual, in this case a native Syrian Arabic speaker who's also fluent in English, examined the training set and labeled pairs of records as matches or non-matches. The information from that training set is fed back into the computer, and the model uses those numerical comparisons to then label all of the millions of possible pairs as matches or non-matches. Go ahead to the next slide. And then as a last step, all of these pairs are then merged into what we call clusters. And the best information from all of those clusters are combined to a single record that contains the most precise information available. So what we're left with is a single data set where each record is unique and indicates which data set it was found in, which may be anywhere from 1 to all 7 of the data sets. So why do we take this particular approach? This approach is scalable. As I mentioned, we have to conduct millions and millions of comparisons, and the more data that we collect, the more comparisons we have to consider. So automating that is really the way to go. It's replicable in the scientific sense. If we give our training set to other researchers, they will generate the same model and the same results, and they can check our work. It's transparent in the sense that we can all discuss whether or not the approach that we made and the decisions that we made seem reasonable. And it's auditable, which means given the approach that we chose, given the decisions that we made, we can discuss whether or not we technically carried out those decisions correctly. And given the gravity of what we're talking about, given the impact that these analyses have the potential to have, we believe that any such analysis must have these 4 criteria. Go ahead. So what we found, as was published a couple of weeks ago, is just under 60,000 uniquely documented killings. Now again, I want to be very clear here. That's the number of unique records across those 7 data sets. There are ways in which that number may be inaccurate, which I'll talk about in just a second. The other things I want to mention are that over 70% of the records in 6 of the data sets were missing information on age. I don't at all mean this to be a criticism. I realize how incredibly difficult it is to collect this data, and I have nothing but respect for the groups that are doing it. But one of the questions that does come up over and over again is how can we tell the story about what's happening in Syria right now? And part of that story is talking about children who are being killed. And with the currently available data, it's difficult to do that statistically because much of the data is missing that information. And then lastly, 4 of the data sets from the Syria Shuhada website, the Syrian Network for Human Rights, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, and the Violation Documentation Center are documenting a lot of the same records. That's what I mean on this slide by the word overlap. But they do differ in ways that I think can be informative to us. And that's one of the things I'm really hoping to accomplish this weekend, is to reflect with all of you what the data says to me as a scientist and what it says to all of you as contextual and field experts. So if we go to the next slide, there are many, many examples of this graph in the report. I have copies of the report for those who are interested. I can also send it to you digitally. But what this is a comparison, in this case, only of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights and the Syrian Network for Human Rights. I've chosen 6 areas just to show as examples, but all of the pink sections in this graph indicate records that are identical between those 2 data sets. So they indicate records of identifiable killings that are included in both data sets. And then the light blue and the dark blue sections indicate records that only one of those groups documented. And I think the places where we notice significant differences, for example, in Daraa at the beginning of the conflict, we know that that was an early part of the conflict, that there were protests, that there was a lot of confusion on the ground, and that because it was early, groups perhaps didn't have all of the same resources and connections and networks that they have now. So I think there are places like that that we can reflect on the different kinds of information that these different groups were able to collect and learn more about this documentation process and improve it moving forward. Go ahead to the next one. Sorry, one back. So one of the other things that must be addressed is the ways in which the number just under 60,000 might be inaccurate. And a part of that is potentially inaccurate records. Now, in our experience over the last 20 years, there are a number of ways that records can be inaccurate. I think of it as a spectrum. Anything from an accidental death mistakenly being categorized as conflict-related, to an individual who is missing, perhaps following a violent event, and who later is found to be alive, but their recorded death remains in data sets, all the way down to, at the end of the spectrum, fabrication of data. Now, we have not conducted this analysis in these 7 data sets, so I do not know what, if any, of these examples are included. But our experience tells us that these are possibilities. And in my communication with some of the documentation groups, I know through their verification processes, they've found records that are inaccurate. And so that brings us to our next steps, which is that we really, in our analyses, need examples of these records that these groups have found, because we can incorporate that information into our computer model and include it as a better way to identify potentially inaccurate records. And then ultimately, as we move forward, we can continue to have a better accounting of what is being documented. And then finally, our last step is a statistical method called multiple systems estimation, which is a way to estimate not only the number of killings that have been documented in all of these data sets, but the number that are uncounted. And that is every bit as important, because not every death is witnessed. Not every death is witnessed by someone who feels secure enough to come forward and tell that story. And every death deserves to be counted. And I'll go ahead and skip 2 slides ahead and just close and say thank you very much.
Thank you, Megan. It's really an impressive presentation and impressive work. Our next speaker will be Mr. Glenn Morgan, expert in analyzing data on war crimes and crimes against humanity. And by the way, Glenn is a consultant with Peace Without Justice too. So please allow him to start his speech.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd just like to start off by saying thank you to the organisers of this event for giving me the opportunity to come and speak with you today, and it is my sincere hope that I may be able to assist in some way with your efforts to achieve a new and just society in your country. As Dr. Cardi mentioned, I am employed as a consultant by No Peace Without Justice to work on their Syria program along with Mustafa from Dawati. And in that context, we're going to be carrying out a number of activities over the coming months. My background is actually in the military. I began my career in the British Army. I then worked in the British Police, and following that I became a war crimes investigator, working in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda. So through that process I've developed a fair amount of practical experience of working in the situations and with the kind of data that we are talking about here today. Subsequent to that, I also worked at Europol, which is the European Union's police intelligence organisation, which is primarily responsible for coordinating the fight against organised crime in the European Union. And as a slight digression from my main subject, I would like to highlight to you the danger of organised crime in a new society that emerges after a conflict. We have particularly seen this with the former Yugoslavia, where the conditions that prevailed during the war, for example the black market, smuggling, the rise of militias, the plentiful availability of weapons and so on, creates the circumstances within which organised crime groups become powerful. And then after the transition to a new regime, there is often the weakening of the policing or the justice ability to fight against organised crime. So it's just a point to emphasise here that in the reform of your police and security services after the transition, you do need to keep in mind the danger of making them so weak that organised crime could flourish. But if I go back to the main subject, which is the analysis of data for justice and accountability. Now, Megan has talked in some detail already about the big numbers, the headline figures which talk about the number of people killed, the number of people tortured and so on. If we're talking about judicial accountability, we're perhaps not so interested in these big figures, but more in the specific detail that relates to the individual crimes. The big figures are certainly important from an advocacy perspective, and hopefully it is those kind of figures that will persuade the Security Council to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court. But if and when the ICC is engaged with the situation in Syria, their investigators and their prosecutors are going to be interested in the detail and the quality of the data rather than the simple quantity of it. So that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. And indeed, my current role as a consultant with other organisations as well as No Peace is to look at the analysis of data and to help countries and organisations build up this capacity to analyse data that can be used in criminal prosecutions. Because in the end, the thing that we're interested in is identifying the person who is responsible, showing the criminal intent that lay behind their actions, and using that as the basis for prosecuting them according to their individual criminal responsibility as a commander. So we need to be able to link together the commanders of the units involved with the activities that actually took place. And I am primarily interested in the kind of data that will allow us to do that. Now, there are many different types of data, there are many different sources from which that data could be gathered. If and when the ICC is engaged, they have teams of professional investigators who will be available to come and gather data in your country from your citizens, from the victims and the witnesses. But until that time, we need to rely upon information that can be gathered by people like yourselves, people in the country. I want to focus this morning on two particular types of data because they are, number one, readily available, and number two, have the potential to become incredibly valuable if we can get our hands on them. And I'm talking here about video footage and about captured documents. I'll come back to video footage in much more detail in a moment, but regarding the captured documents, let me just remind you of the scenes that we have seen on the television in Iraq, in Egypt and in Libya, where large groups of people celebrating after the regime has fallen go into the ministries, the police stations,